Welcome, everyone, and our listening audience to our daily weekday morning podcast on Kabbalah for Heretics. As I say every morning, with me, your heretic in chief, Yakov Leib HaKohain. Let me remind you again, as I have so many times in the past, um, for those of you who may be new to these podcasts, that name, Yakov Leib HaKohain, is my name. I was given that name by my family when I was born. It's not a name I picked up or made up or grabbed out of the blue in order to sound Hebrew. It's my name. I'm 82 years old, and back when I was born, and possibly even now, but certainly in that generation and prior to that, Jewish families, especially a son, gave that son two names in this country. A Hebrew name, usually which perpetuated a, uh, a member of the family who had passed on. In my case, actually, my maternal grandfather, Yakov Leib. And that was just used among the Yidden. But they also gave that child an English name, a public name. In my case, Lawrence Jerome. So don't think I'm making it up. Don't think it's an affectation. It's a name I'm very proud of. It means the heart of Jacob, the priest. Yaakov Leib, heart of Jacob, HaKohain, the priest. Again, not self-designated. The reason the HaKohain is because I was born into a family of traditional, hereditary, Levitical priests. I've talked enough about that in the past. I don't think I'll get into it again. So there again, it's not just something I picked out of the air. With that summary in mind, let's get back to where we left off. And again, just to bring you up to date, for the past 30 years, now please hear that, every weekday morning, and sometimes weekends, every weekday morning at this time, with very rare exceptions, we have been studying the Zohar, volume by volume, cover to cover, page by page, sentence by sentence. This is no fly-by-night class, so-called, on the Zohar. This is a great project undertaken 30 years ago by me and some of you who are still with me. Doing that, we have completed volumes 1, 2, and 3, now well into volume 4, Parsha Shemini of Leviticus. Let's pick up where we left off. Rabbi Yitzchak said, why is the letter bet open on one side and closed on the other? Now, unfortunately, you really have to see a drawing of the Hebrew letter bet, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, in order to get this, because it is drawn that way. It is. It's open on one side and closed on the other. It says, why is that? And it gives a response to that rhetorical question. To show when a man comes to attach himself to the Torah, it is open to receive him and to join with him. And when a man closes his eyes to it and walks in the other way, then it turns its closed side to him, according to the saying, quote, "If thou leavest me someday, I will leave thee 2 days," until he returns to attach himself to it, never again to abandon it. This is, for reasons I'll touch upon now, rather troubling. I know most people just take something like this for granted, but look at what it's saying. The Torah is saying to the man, if you abandon me, I will abandon you. Nya, 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 nya. Where's this oft-forgiving God that just a few paragraphs ago was being discussed? Am I being clear here about this point? Oh, you're just reading that into it. No, I'm not reading it into it. I'm reading it out of it. That's what it's saying. Rabbi Yitzchak said, why is the letter bet open on one side and closed on the other? You have to picture the Hebrew text of Genesis, and the very first word is Bereshis, starting with the letter bet. Bereshis bara Elohim et hashamayim, bet. So why is the bet open on the left side and closed on the right? Because that's the way it is. Why? I think it gives an answer that you would not expect and that you mustn't just slough over. The answer it gives to show that when a man comes to attach himself to the Torah from the left-hand side, from the side of evil, it is open to receive him and to join with him. But when a man closes his eyes to it and walks in the other way, then it turns its closed side to him. According to the saying, quote, if thou leavest me one day, I will leave thee 2 days. And he returns to attach himself to it later, never again to abandon it. Therefore, the Torah makes the first approaches to men, proclaiming, unto you, O men, I call. And it is also written of her, she cried in the chief places of concourse at the entering of the gates. It continues about the letter bet, but let's stop and look at this again. There's some added information here. The letter bet is the feminine. The letter bet is the feminine. It is the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Forget about the text of Genesis. In the Hebrew alphabet, it is the second letter, preceded by the first letter, Aleph, which is masculine. Out of the masculine comes the feminine. Oh, that's terrible. How can you be so chauvinistic? Well, no, I'm sorry. That's exactly what it says in the Torah. In the second creation, it is out of the masculine ensouled Adam that the feminine is brought forth. The feminine is brought forth from the masculine in order to lead the masculine. Look at the arrangements. It goes from right to left. There is the masculine Aleph, out of which comes the feminine Bet. And she then leads the masculine. So it's not chauvinistic to talk about the feminine coming forth from the masculine. Now you also have to look at the letter Bet and Aleph itself. Again, as I said, the letter bet comes after the letter aleph. If you look at it, its back is closed to the masculine aleph from which it has come. Its front is open. Again, I wish you had a drawing of the Hebrew alphabet in front of you. This is significant. It is involved in the whole Kabbalah of the Hebrew letters, which is a whole approach to understanding Kabbalah. But you'll notice there is no letter previous to the aleph. There is no letter previous to that. It exists in and of itself. But out of it, moving to the left, comes the feminine, the bet. Now there she is. There she is. In back of her is the aleph. Her backside, facing the aleph, is closed. Her front side, facing the remainder of the Hebrew alphabet, is open, literally. There is the suggestion here that there is a closing off of the aleph to the bet. There is a closing off, originally, of the masculine to the feminine. There is, if you will, a machlochis, a conflict between them, between the masculine and the feminine. And indeed, in the very beginning, in Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament, you clearly see that Yahweh, the aleph, has a real gripe against the feminine. When you read in the text, tear down the trees from the mountaintops, etc., Yahweh is instructing to tear down worship of the feminine, because that's what the trees on the mountaintops were used for worship of the feminine. There is a rejection of the feminine in the early stages of the evolution of God's consciousness and man's consciousness. And that barrier is on the right-hand side of the bet, the side of mercy, love, compassion, chesed in the 10 Sephiros. But the side that it's open to is the left, the side of anger, hostility. God draws us in through his gevurah. God draws us in through his wrath and anger, even unholiness and evil. But we are saved by the feminine, except not yet. She is not yet there. She is closed until the coming of the Messiah, who re-establishes the feminine in God. Christ does exactly that. Yahweh God, the Father God in the Old Testament, is the God of anger and wrath, darkness. But the God of the New Testament, the Christ, is a God of love, light, feminine. Jesus, as it were, as an example of the Messiah, came in order to reestablish the feminine with the masculine, so that man can, in fact, live in peace with God, and God can, in fact, live in love with man. Now, before you dismiss that as something you already know, I hasten to remind you that you do not know it. And if anything, you're rejecting it. Oh no, Jesus came to save man. Well, how? How does he save man? Oh, by forgiving man's sins. Yes, in part. But he also comes to forgive the sins of God. Jung points out in answer to Job, get ready, that Jesus dies on the cross not just in order to atone for the sins of man against God, but for the sins of God against man. I can just hear out of the 4,000 or 5,000 listeners that we get every morning, I can just hear the gates slamming shut at that. Jesus, as an incarnation of the Messiah, dies on the cross in order to rectify and save man from his sins against God. But even more, he dies in order to save God himself from his sins against man. Look at the Old Testament. Look at David, King David, in the Psalms, complaining to God, you never do what you say you're going to do. You say you're going to love me and hate me. You say you're going to prosper me and you kill me. That's the nature of God. Prior to the coming of the Messiah, God, rejecting its feminine, sitting virtually exclusively in its masculine, is a God of anger and wrath, unpredictability, even if you will, dishonesty. It is wild, uncontrolled. It is a force of nature. And like nature, is neither moral nor immoral in a sense. It's just completely lacking in that. It vacillates between evil and good, unpredictably. Yahweh does. That is stabilized by the sacrifice of the Messiah in order to reestablish and rejoin the feminine to the masculine. This gives us a whole different perspective on the reason for the crucifixion of the Messiah. That is, the Messiah in the person of Jesus, in the Jesus incarnation. There were Messiah incarnations prior to Jesus, and there have been Messiah incarnations after Jesus. Jesus was not the first and the last incarnation of the Messiah, contrary to what the Christians want to believe. We are told quite clearly in the Oral Torah, not here specifically right here, that there are two Mashiachs, Mashiach ben Joseph and Mashiach ben David. Mashiach ben Joseph comes in order to prepare the way for the coming of the final Messiah, Messiah ben David. Mashiach ben Joseph, of all things, is called Messiah with a sword. Jesus says to his followers, if you do not have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Jesus came in order to prepare the way ritually and fundamentally for the later, much later coming of the Messiah ben David, the final Messiah. That's why the Christian idea of his second coming doesn't happen. There is no second coming. There's either the next coming of the final Messiah ben David or another incarnation of Messiah ben Joseph. And what we have seen is exactly the latter. We have seen incarnations of the Mashiach ben Joseph multiple times since the Jesus event. He says, I will send you the Paraclete. And when I do, you will be able to do everything I have done and more. He doesn't say, I'm coming back. The Paraclete, the Comforter, Mashiach, again, ben Joseph. That's why there have been many Mashiachs ben Joseph, accepted or not usually. Often more than one in any historical period. The great Rebbe Nachman of Breslov was considered Mashiach ben Joseph. He considered himself Mashiach ben Joseph. That's why he could speak in the way he did. For example, he says, after I die, if you come to my grave and read these 10 Psalms, I will move heaven and earth to save you. I will reach down and grab you by your sideburns and pull you out of hell. That's not the statement of a common man. And he said that publicly. It's recorded also publicly. Look it up. You'll find it, one of the many quotes in the sayings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. He recognized he was not the final Messiah. He came at the same time Jacob Frank came. And Jacob Frank was surely not Mashiach ben David, but surely Mashiach ben Joseph with a sword. Gershom Scholem describes Messiah Jacob Frank, who was accepted by thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews as the Messiah, as a fearful, fearsome, evil entity, man. He was the full expression of God's left-hand side. Jung says the reason such a thing happens is to prepare the way for a coming of the total right-hand side. And you thought this was all very simple. You thought the Zohar was full of moral lessons about how to live your life in a sacred Jewish way. Let me repeat, the Zohar has absolutely nothing to do with the Jewish religion. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Jewish religion. For 30 years, we have been studying it word by word, volume by volume, and nowhere does it proceed out of the Jewish religion. It is a meta text. It goes beyond any concept of religion and morality. It deals with God. The Zohar is dealing with the inner nature of God. We are dealing here with the inner nature of God. Not how to behave oneself. Not how to be a good Jew. We are dealing with the inner nature of God. No wonder it's so hidden, so secret, and was demanded by God to be transmitted only orally and not in writing. Now that changed in about the 3rd century, where it was committed to writing. What the rabbis who use the Zohar to teach moral lessons of Judaism are doing is pounding a square peg into a round hole. any of you who have been listening to these podcasts, and particularly listening to the verbatim reading that I give of the text, knows it has nothing to do with Judaism. Doesn't talk about keeping kosher. Doesn't talk about observing the Sabbath. None of that. None. So shut up and listen to what it is talking about. If you do. Because if you do, it will bring you to a greater understanding of God. Not yourself, not the Jewish religion, not even mankind, but God. Now, of course, you may not believe in God. You may say, oh, that's ridiculous. There is no God to be aware of. Well, if you feel that way, you're wasting your time listening to these podcasts. And I urge you to stop listening. You're wasting your time and mine. But if you have this predisposition toward God, if you have this predilection for God, the Zohar is going to bring you quite literally into its presence and help you to understand what it is you're standing in front of. I'll stop there, and we'll continue with this tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I always ask my recording technicians who are here if they have any comments or questions, thereby representing the thousands and thousands of you who are listening. Yeshaya, do. All right, David, or comment, raise your hand. Good. Go ahead. Again, while we're waiting, I do not expect visitors to come to these podcast recordings. I don't expect it, and you're not required to. And in fact, very often I kick people out who come because it's not a class. It's a recording session. Yeshai, go ahead. David, go ahead. Waiting for Yeshai and David. Here we go. Hang on. I think this is David. The discussion of the letter Bet is beautifully analogous to the discussion of the appearances of the Messiah. Bet, the feminine, comes after Aleph, the mat. That is wonderful. The Aleph. One enters it from the left-hand side. That side of God's wrath, anger, capriciousness. One approaches it as to attach oneself to the Torah. To show when a man comes to attach himself to the Torah, it is open to receive him and attach itself. And when he chooses to leave, he closes himself to it, as if to say, if you abandon me, I will abandon you. Well, yes, and big point. We didn't really talk enough about that, about the vindictive nature of God. You abandon me, I'll abandon you. That's what it's saying. Jesus was not the first or last incarnation of the Mashiach. Yeshua ben Joseph, Messiah with a sword, the masculine, to make way for the Mashiach ben David, the final Messiah, the Redeemer, the feminine. Oh, beautiful. Right on, David. Yasher Koach. Yasher Koach. That's why I love your point about the first Mashiach ben Joseph is like the letter Aleph, masculine, and the Mashiach itself is like the letter, is like the Bet, feminine. Indeed, you see that. Jesus says, get yourself a sword. Sabbatai Zevi didn't say, get yourself a sword, but he behaved that way. They all did. Jacob Frank, for God's sake. They were all Mashiachs, then Joseph, Messiah with a sword, cutting down the weeds in order to allow the grasses to shine. Thank you, David. Beautiful. Yeshai, go ahead. Yeshai, massive wash of spinal Holy Spirit shivers through me on the Zohar, bringing us in if we have this predilection for God. Powerful broadcast, inspiring with this detailing of the primal first state of God's conflict against its feminine side, stamped into the structure of the bet, oriented with the aleph, etc. Absolutely. Is it any wonder that typically men do not want to appear to be feminine? Stop and think. Now that's changing. But in my lifetime, in our lifetime and before, the masculine was men don't cry, for example. And there was for oneself a rejection of everything feminine. That is God's rejection of its own feminine side. Baruch Hashem, beautiful comments, Yeshai and David. Thank you. Now we'll close, as I do every morning, by reciting the traditional prayer for the dead in honor of the soul of our beloved friend and fellow Kohen who has passed away, of course, Leonard Cohen. Yiskadav Yiskadav Shmei Rabo, Bomo Divro Chirusei V'yamlich Malchusei, B'chai Chonav Yom Yechonav Chai Edechol B'Yis Yisrael Bagalo, Uvizman Korevim Amen, Yehei Shmei Rabo Migrach Le'elam Umnei Maya, Yisbarach v'yistabach v'yisbar v'yisalam v'yisaseh v'yisadar v'yisaleh v'yisalal Shmei Dekut Shabrichu Le'elam Minchal v'yichosa Tushpechosa v'nechemosa Damiran B'mo v'yimnu Amen. Yehei Shalom Rabba Min Shemaya v'chayinu Eleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'yimnu Amen. Osei Shalom b'mramov Hu Yasei Shalom Aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Let everyone say Amen. That concludes our podcast for this morning. God willing, I'll be here, and I hope all of you in the listening audience will be here tomorrow morning. Until then, Yivarechecha Adonai